Вот этот танк, его пантера подбила. Из засады выскочил.
Почему ты так решил?
Он мне сам рассказал.
Кто рассказал?
Танк.
I hear the machine spirit's voice.
White Tiger is the tale of a pioneering tech adept and one of the first disciples of the machine god. His tank having been destroyed in a previous battle, our main character was found amidst the wreckage, still clutching onto the controls with the determination in his eyes despite being severely burnt. Saved through divine intervention by the Omnissiah, he had literally been baptized in fire, being reborn enlightened. Although he had lost all cognition of his former identity, his understandings of the machine spirits were elevated, unshackled from the vices of mortal flesh, and overcome by the righteous desire to carry out the will of the Omnissiah. He takes the task of hunting down and putting an end to an unholy abomination of a machine, the amalgamations of the ruinous energies extracted from the collective circle jerk of sweaty wereaboos have over their stupid box tank, and avenge the machine spirits that have met their demise at the hands of such aberration. Okay, alright. I know I like to take the Mechanicus LARP a bit seriously on this channel, but this isn't a fucking LARP. This is basically what the movie is about. Anyway, speaking of abomination, I assume a sizable portion of the people watching this video are familiar with or at least overheard the story of the actual White Tiger itself. Prior to filming, an actual replica of a Tiger 1 was commissioned, but it was made too late. Historically, most films who had made an effort to try to recreate a Tiger 1 would normally modify a cheap and readily available tank like a T-55. Otherwise, they just outright not even bother and slap iron crosses onto whatever contemporary tank they can obtain and call it a Tiger. Anyway, since there is only one running Tiger 1 in the world, the replica was a pretty big deal, but unfortunately we didn't get to see it on screen. Instead, what they use is a modified IS tank, which admittedly props for them for experimenting with an actual heavy tank for the base of their Tiger cosplay, but I get why people have taken issue with this. The dimensions of the IS tank make it difficult to pull off a believable Tiger cosplay. Heck, even with the T-34 ones, the forward-leaning turret does make things look a little off. Fun point of trivia while we're at it. Within the advertisements for this film, there is a great discrepancy in regard to what tank is featured to represent the White Tiger. From the actual prop used in the film, the replica, or straight up an unmodified IS and T-55. The unknown soldier is given the name Nadianov, which means found. But for the sake of simplicity, I'll be referring to him as N, cause like the Pokemon character who can talk to Pokemon naturally, Nadianov here has been blessed with the ability to naturally commune with the machine spirits. So what are the powers that the Omnissiah has granted Magos Nadianov? Well, these include the aforementioned ability to directly commune with the machine spirits, which proves useful during battles, as the machine spirit will alert him of potential dangers, earning him a reputation of a good driver. He is also unshackled of the vices of mortal flesh, as is exemplified in these two scenes, where one he is not hindered by the desire for food and water, and the other where it shows a stark contrast between him and the rest of his crew, whilst his crew decides to indulge in the hedonistic pleasures of flesh, and is instead in communion with machine spirits and meditating in the beneficence of the Omnissiah. And if you still think I'm LARPing and I'm just bending things to fit my LARP perspective, let Magos Nadianov explain it himself.
Да.
А этот бог, он где?
На небе он сидит на нем. А вокруг все танки, которые погибли в сражениях. Когда он в нее садится, начинает грохотать, сверкают молнии. Вот видите? Я танки слышу. Все танки говорят. Их никто не слышит, а я их слышу. А они, когда в них снаряды летят, предупреждают меня, и я ухожу от снарядов. Так они мне помогают. Хотят, чтобы я тигра этого белого сжег.
I must return to my communion with the machine spirits. You should return to the sector map for your next assignment.
Okay. To be fair, the concepts of machines having some sort of soul or spirit isn't exactly new. In fact, the way we refer to ships as she stems from the idea of a motherly spirit protecting the crew on the voyage.
The machine spirit shall protect us.
The idea of a machine god is a natural extension. The film does not primarily focus on N per se, but rather this colonel, who is tasked by his superiors to hunt down the White Tiger, and in his quest acquaints himself with N, seeing him as an optimal candidate for the job upon hearing of the aforementioned adaptitudes. From here, the audience follows along from the colonel's perspective as N's gifts are slowly revealed, and the colonel tries to piece together what is happening in front of him. Speaking from a technical perspective, the movie does a decent job of creating an aura of surreality and confusion, both the White Tiger and N, which is seen most strongly in the first part, using ambience, pacing, and specific dialogue, starting off seemingly normal but slowly getting more esoteric as it progresses, having the audience follow the colonel along as he processes what he hears and sees from N and the roller coaster of emotions and internal conflicts he has from having his worldview challenged.
Знает, кого на фронт отправляет. Ему в дурдом надо, а не его на фронт.
Wait, why didn't they just assume that he looked at the impact mark and is trying to fuck with them instead of calling him insane? I like the way this is done. The character does not have to outright say what he is feeling, but these emotions are implied in the kinds of conversations he has both with N and with other characters until the big reveal when he hears from the Magos himself. And later on,
Хочешь этим сказать? После 90% ожогов люди не выживают. И Найденов тогда сгорел. Сгорел и родился сам. Другим человеком. Идеально приспособленным для войны. Он ее порождение.
What is he doing?
He's beginning to believe.
I think this is something that Russian films generally do well. Historically speaking, Russia pioneered in many film techniques during the early days of cinema, and generally speaking, this has stayed consistent, even though many consider the golden age of Russian cinema to have passed. Then, as the movie goes on, we get to see something that I see as a recurring weakness in Russian films: their action sequences. Something that I think that Russian films, particularly many modern films, do not always get right. By not getting right, I'm not saying that they are not good, but there are some really noticeable rough edges and unpolished areas that really cripple the experience. Despite how Russian studios are able to bring to bear the full might of decommissioned Soviet military hardware that Western studios could only dream of having, but they struggle to bring it to bear in a meaningful manner, making it fall short of excellence and losing potential. On the contrast, many Western films tend to be good at making an otherwise bad scene at least entertaining to look at. And before we say this is a product of the time, to put things in perspective, this film, Battle of Moscow, was released in 1985. Battle of the Bulge came out in 1965. Bridge at Remagen in 19...
Sorry.
Battle of the Bulge came out in 1965, Bridge at Remagen in 1969, Kelly's Hero was in 1970, and Bridge Too Far was in 1977. I won't go into too much detail, but if we compare the battles in these films we have mentioned so far, the Western ones generally tend to have an upper hand. Okay, while editing this, I realized I forgot to specify that the criticisms that are about to follow are primarily concerning their war films set in World War II period and after. There are actually some really good Russian films about the World War I era and before, in particular the Napoleonic War era. Although it may be more of an issue of them not being able to scale well with other contemporary films, even with recent films like Tanker, which came out in 2020. Often their scene compositions are actually quite good, but they either overlook or leave unpolished another aspect of the scene, which ends up sticking out like a sore thumb, which annoys me because a lot of these are otherwise good scenes. Could it hurt to edit a more realistic cannon blast and a recoil effect on the gun? Just little things like these make these films feel more like a remastered film from the 80s rather than one made for 2020. There seems to be a strange paradox that haunts many Russian films, particularly when it comes to the use of digital enhancements. They either use too much or use too little. Either go all in with these special effects to the point it loses meaning, often spamming them in parts that didn't need them whilst ignoring parts that could have legitimately benefited from them. I actually like these shell impact scenes. Imagine how much better it would be if they used actual tanks, or just uses a minuscule amount to the point it looks cheesy and crude. In the latter case, heavily relying on practical effects when CG could have offered an objectively better, more realistic alternative. They never seem to get it quite right, and the White Tiger fits into this latter category. Oddly enough, there are a lot of people who praise this style as being more realistic and faithful to actual war, which is just plain bullshit. The obvious matters of blanks and practical effects not being at all realistic. I'm pretty sure most people who think this are self-identified wannabe gomies, trying to think their taste is somehow better because they like something that isn't, you know, American. Because they think giving critical support to Russia and I guess Russian media is somehow intellectual and moral high ground and combating Western imperialism, including cultural imperialism. Conversely to films like T-34 and Slomograd, many Russian films fall into the category of being able to bring an impressive fuckton of actual military hardware to bear, but they are used so sloppily it loses meaning and ends up being a wasted potential. Just throwing a bunch of military hardware on the screen and shaking the camera can be just as bad of a crutch as putting a famous person on the screen, shaking the camera, and putting a bunch of flashes onto it, at least when it comes to the story. Now don't misinterpret me. CGI and special effects are not essential into delivering a good war film, but it can greatly enhance the experience, and in cases like the White Tiger, application could have served plot-related focus, making the White Tiger seem as terrifying and mysterious as it is hyped up to be. This could very well be a cultural thing. Russians may be adverse to examining techniques pioneered in the West for the sake of pride, but I'm not going to go further into that kind of worms. I'm just putting it out there as a possibility and a concern. This could also be an instance where the Western industries have more of an incentive to invest into more novel techniques to make up for their lack of access to military hardware, whereas the Russians' ready access to military gear made them complacent from a time where spamming real vehicles on screen was in itself seen as a spectacular thing. Anyways, White Tiger is no exception to this paradox that haunts many Russian films, fitting into the category of despite being able to bring an impressive array of historical vehicles, I cannot help but feel as if they were not used to their full potential. In the film, there are two main battle scenes worth of note, and I believe that both of them suffer from poor execution, both in terms of how they are composed and the story-related context behind them. In the wider context, I believe that these do hinder the story, as these scenes serve the purpose of presenting to the audience the surreal power of the White Tiger, and in theory show that it is indeed a threat that is befitting of what the film wants the audience to believe. Having scenes of intense action in this case serves the purpose of the overall plot. The first scene worth of note is where N and Co are trying to ambush the tiger, setting up in an area where the tiger recently struck. I personally think that the scene would have been much more impactful if the audience saw the ambush occurring, or had a much more impactful aftermath scene where instead of a couple of burning T-34s, perhaps N interrogates a bunch of survivors. The actual battle itself is felt wanting, mainly from a technical point of view. The opening stages of this scene, I have to admit, are done quite well, where the colonel is resting and hears the White Tiger approaching. The film captures him trying to frantically follow the White Tiger, trying to take a picture, and the acting here really does do a good job of presenting the urgency. I still think that it would have been more impactful if there was more solid background to the scene shown, but as it is, it still holds merit. The slow motion, explosion spam, and snap cutting, however, gets really obnoxious. Although I do believe that switching from showing the character's emotions to the carnage can be effective, I think it's a bit overdone. If you want to take a page out of Western cinema, I don't think anyone would recommend taking inspiration from Michael Bay. The editing and transitioning really give off the feeling that this was a half-assed attempt to try hard. It relies heavily on rapid jump cuts to convey correlating actions, and while such techniques can be used effectively, in this context it's clear that it's the only trick they had up their sleeve. Also, the fact that the two tanks are never seen in the same frame to establish the general positioning and situation to the audience is one of the things that kind of ruined the scene. Look at this portion of the scene from Fury, for example. We see the Tiger and Brad Pitt in the same frame, the Tiger fires, and then we cut over to the shell impact. The way this scene in White Tiger does it feels like it's meant to be an illusion, and it makes it very clear that it's not happening in real time. This is what I mentioned earlier when I said Russian films are unable to scale well with developments in film techniques. Something like this would have been great in the late 80s, acceptable in the late 90s and early 2000s, but in 2016 it's just cheap and lazy, where it just establishes where the both tanks are in relation to the terrain this exchange is taking place, would probably have elevated the scene quite a bit. Instead of the establishing shot just being the colonel like looking at one tank and then snapping his head and looking at the other, I guess to avoid having to show both tanks in the same spot. Also, despite having set up their tank in a pretty well camouflaged position, they send their bait tank to some random clearing and N and friends has to abandon their position to engage the White Tiger. They should have just set up with the clearing and the forest where the battle takes place in their field of view, use the other tank to make the Tiger pointed side armor to them, and then they take a shot, and then have the Tiger take on and defeat both of the tanks at the same time. The scene ends with the Tiger teleporting behind N's tank and pulling a nothing personnel kid. This, I think, is a good example of where the abstention of special effects can actually enhance the experience. If they tried to like actually show the Tiger teleporting, I think that would have been too corny. One of the more ambitious aspects of this film is its attempt to try to balance the realism with fantasy elements. Many films based on history have attempted to do so in the past, and to do so is not easy. You need to strike a balance between the two, and the way that the balance is struck differs from a case-to-case basis. Many films fall into the mistake of making the fantasy elements so obvious that you can't take it seriously, and conversely make it so subtle that it goes over audiences' heads. In White Tiger, other than the reveal of Mengos Nadyenov's adaptations, which I have already praised the film for, the other fantasy/surreal element is the White Tiger, and since the White Tiger doesn't talk, it is up to the few scenes where the tiger is shown on screen to bear the burden of justifying what has been spoken about the White Tiger by other characters. Overall, I cannot fault much on this ending sequence of the battle itself, showing both the tactical prowess of N thanks to his intimate connection with the machine spirits and the supernatural nature of the White Tiger. However, I think the aforementioned awkward lingering shots and cheap Michael Bay effects really kill the potential this sequence had. Plus, making the situation seem more dire, as mentioned earlier, would have helped a lot. However, the issue I have with this sequence is nothing compared to what I have with the next one. The next scene kind of pisses me off, not because of the execution per se. I'm not going to bother with nitpicking at the scene itself because the premise of the scene almost makes me cringe seeing the amount of effort and material that went into making it and how it actually turned out. The scene opens with an artillery barrage with a bunch of ISU-152, SU-100s, and ZIS-3s. This seems to be in preparation for, like, I want to say a battalion level advance where they are crossing something. There is no context given to what the fuck they are doing, and the White Tiger appears and kills them all. They say that the way forth has been cleared of enemies. Then what was the purpose of the artillery barrage? Are they assuming that a brief barrage alone cleared the way? Are they thinking that if the White Tiger is there, the barrage was enough to kill it?
Плотно идут. Одной батареи пожечь можно.
Товарищ командир, на 10 километров вперед все вычистили. До самой переправы ни одного фашиста не осталось.
But they also act like the way had been cleared for a while by then. And if they're so confident, why did they bother wasting ammo and sending them fully kitted, almost as if they were launching a full frontal attack on an enemy fortified position? All whilst not even using scouts to scout out the way or anything. What are they trying to cross? Where are they trying to go through? What we are seeing and the information we are given is really fucking incoherent. This scene ends up feeling like a, hey, look how many tanks we can shove on the screen. Oh, you like explosion? We can shove a bunch of those too. Looking back, I am inclined to believe there is a strong probability that this scene was made with the explicit intention of mocking Western film culture and Western film stereotypes. A better way of having the scene play out would have been to show the main characters involved in an actual engagement with enemy combatants. The Soviets are pushing their way into a German position. The Germans are on the back foot and hastily falling back. This could have also presented an opportunity to have Nadyenov show his tactical skills in actual battle, giving orders decisively and maybe even dodging a Panzerschreck at the last second thanks to his intimate connection with the tank's machine spirit. And then when all seems lost for the Germans, the White Tiger comes around and turns the tide, at least up until N has his final showdown with it.
Rouse the engines! Optimal course set! Hostile signature detected. Focusing war site. Severe damage to their corrupted machine. With matchless efficiency. Enhance rotational drift. Hostile signature detected. Thruster routines active. Optimal course set. Collision protocols active. The spirits obey. Severe damage to their corrupted machine. Machine spirits nearing dissipation.
This would also explain why there was this random Panzer IV in what was a seemingly abandoned village. Regardless, these aren't insane expectations, and all my suggestions here are things I fully know that one of the biggest Russian movie studios, Mosfilm, are capable of doing based on their history and other parts of the film, especially considering the fact of their massive arsenal that they had at disposal for this scene. The couple of scenes leading up to the final scene between the Colonel and N are extremely out of place for the film, seeming to serve no purpose to the overarching story, and I have a suspicion that the reason they are shown has to do with some of the director's personal political affiliations and ideological beliefs. By the way, this goes on for almost 30 fucking minutes. Even without them, the film is long enough to be classed as a feature film, so it was completely unnecessary even from that standpoint. There's this scene where it shows the German generals having dinner after their surrender, and this really drawn out scene where it just shows parts of the carnage of the city. And finally, there's this really bizarre scene at the end of the film, which is supposedly Hitler in hell trying to justify why he went to war in the first place. Admittedly, these are quite well done and emotive scenes, capturing the doom, gloom, and lamentations of the generals, showing the carnage of war and how people react to it. But why in this film? In the context of the wider story, this serves little purpose. Back to what I said about the director's political affiliation. The director, Karen Shakhnazarov, who is also the CEO of Mosfilm, is very unapologetic and open about his political views. His political stance can be described as best a very convicted patriot, or at worst an outright unironic Nazbol. The closing half an hour or so, I have a strong suspicion, was made for the purpose of shoehorning ideology and his moral beliefs into the film. Something that Karen has spoken publicly and emphasized a lot in his filmmaking was the idea that the villains should not seem two-dimensional, and there should be efforts to make the audience sympathize with the villains' motivations. But here's the thing, this film doesn't have villains. The conflict in this film really is man versus nature, with the white tiger being portrayed more as a force of nature rather than an archetypal antagonist. This leaves me thinking that these out-of-place scenes was a way for the director to try to shoehorn some of his ideological beliefs into the film, simultaneously trying to glorify the achievements of the Soviets, whilst at the same time trying to humanize and rationalize the ultra-nationalism of the Nazis. The best case scenario would be this was either an oversight or a cheesy way of dodging accusations of Russian bias that ended up falling flat like those woke marketing campaigns. It could have just been the public surrender scene, and when the colonel arrives back with brief glimpses of surrendered Germans and some of the carnage, and the final scene between him and N. And the film could have just ended there without this bullshit Hitler scene. Okay, let's face facts. As much as I have been trying to treat this like one of those evangelical Christian films but for the Adeptus Mechanicus, as it's often said, reality is often disappointing. The vast majority of enjoyment I got out of this film was from the allusions to machine spirits and a potential machine god. Despite this, I think a film does do a good job of conveying the layer of mystery, making the audience feel confused, but in a good way, as the focus is not on N nor the White Tiger, but rather the mental journey the Colonel character goes through as he tries to make sense of the things going on around him, trying to grasp for what is real. The ambiguous ending even lays out the possibility that the Colonel had hallucinated what was going on and was indeed going insane.
Stellar fields activated. Charging warp drive. Seals lock. Jump activated.
Again, these emotive aspects of the film are something that Russian films historically have done well. The action scenes, on the other hand, I do find wanting. Having the presence of the white tiger appear more threatening would have certainly helped the overall plot of the movie, and the lack of sense and context behind the second battle feels like a sequence of events that had the explicit intention of just being a part of the movie that was set up and lack any meaningful context behind it. Really does make it disappointing, especially considering all the hardware and effort they brought on screen. Finally, the out-of-place inclusions of certain scenes near the end, and the implications behind them I discussed earlier, kind of leaves a bad taste in my mouth and makes you question the intentions of the film. It hits you out of nowhere, spoils the mood, and instead of leaving the film with the audience appreciating the film itself, they are left going, what the fuck was that thing around the end all about?
Найденов?
From the moment I understood the weakness of my flesh, it disgusted me. I craved the strength and certainty of steel. I aspired to the purity of the blessed machine.